Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie and Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're talking about sports, politics, and struggle. And we're joined for this conversation by Nate Wallace, co-host of Redspin Sports Podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And, Nate, there was a recent controversy when Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Desean Jackson posted an anti-Semitic quote on social media. I believe he was punished by the team for this. And while certainly on the one hand, anti-Semitism shouldn't be tolerated, but it also seems that all of the response from this kind of whitewashed the NFL's relationship with Israel, which I don't think a lot of folks may be aware of. And of course, the continued subjugation and oppression of the Palestinian people. And I mean, this comes after Israel's most recent annexation of the West Bank, the implications on Palestine for Trump's, quote unquote, deal of the century or peace deal. And so really, Nate, I'm wondering how you sort of see the Desean Jackson issue sort of connected to this relationship with the league and the broader issue around apartheid in Israel.
Well, I mean, when this whole story broke, immediately my kind of skepticism antenna went up in terms of not about whether or not Desean Jackson's, like, the words he reshared were anti-Semitic. I mean, they were. And in a recent episode we just dropped part one of on Redspin Sports with Mike Sampson, my co-host, and Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone, we really dive into, like, what kind of forces are at play here. Jackson, we're in the midst of a pandemic. Live sports have been sidelined like we've never seen really before in modern history. So, and really live sports is a space where it's one of the last, like, spaces is DVR immune. It's like where people kind of gather in real time in this era of media fragmentation, where people are kind of all off on their own thing in Hulu or Netflix or whatever kind of space they are watching something. Live sports create this space. So a lot of athletes, like everybody else with this pandemic disrupted routines, are kind of like, getting into more reading, trying to reflect on things, learn about things. Jackson, what he said is basically like kind of just the typical, kind of like anti-Semitic trope of like Jews trying to control the world and that sort of thing. And that's wrong and needs to be condemned. But it sort of was covered in a way as if like he got online and was just looking for like this some sort of Hitler quote or something to share, and was just like this sort of just innate anti-Semite, that instead of like looking at the context of the fact that there's a lot of times like a lack of real interaction and distinction between the there was a lack of interaction in a lot of oppressed communities of color with like Jewish people beyond like just maybe the landlord who's coming through, and like, or someone else that they've like, that they haven't had the interactions with people to realize that just like every culture, there's people that are good, bad, and everything in between. And I think Jackson, in the wake of this now, has been pushed into a sort of re-education through his group called From the Depths, actually kind of jumped in. They used a Holocaust survivor by the name of Edward Mossberg, who's in his 90s, and while he suffered horrors, certainly under the Nazi Holocaust, and that's undeniable. He's become in this context in the U.S. the guy who's really kind of sent out to kind of really be like Desean Jackson's teacher. Kind of invited him to Auschwitz, and the idea that he needs to sort of, this group is a very pro far right Israel, Trump, Netanyahu aligned, lobby outfit essentially. And it's just problematic that instead of all the Jewish academics, intellectuals, religious leaders he could meet with, that instead, like, the idea that he's being reclaimed, that he's being, this reclamation project is being led by a group that's really has a really, dark agenda, in the sense that they whitewash people like anti-Semites in Eastern Europe and like Viktor Orban in Hungary, and you look at like the situation in Poland with Andrzej Duda, and the way in which that they are really trying to recast like the idea that they have no culpability for the Holocaust and collaboration with the Nazis, and it's all about Israel and the idea that Palestinians being whitewashed from history, the idea that their oppression being kind of written out of narratives is not a problem. As long as you're willing to politically support that, essentially, then, anti-Semitism in your own country, Poland, Hungary, these places we see anti-Semitism on the rise, isn't an issue. So Jackson is now, the way in which basically the aftermath of this has been framed. Julian Edelman's Instagram video saying, let's make an equation between visiting, let's go visit the Holocaust Museum, the African American History Museum in D.C. Max Blumenthal does a great job on our episode of really kind of breaking down why that's problematic and really a false equivalency. So it's tough to zone in it, but yeah, in the wake of the West Bank annexation, in the wake of the continued misery of Palestinians in Gaza, they just going nowhere. It's just people. There's no real economy, just mass unemployment, and yet we're seeing the disciplining of Jackson with no context really being brought into the larger issues in play here about who some of these groups are and why people like Julian Edelman aren't having to also apologize for whitewashing what happens to Palestinians and the day-to-day oppression and really indirectly, supporting genocide against them by constantly coming out supporting the IDF. Going on these, and you see it with, I'll get into it in a minute, but if you want to respond before we go on, there's just NFL players galore that Bob Kraft has a big role of, the New England Patriots owner, in bringing to Israel every year and really using biblical narratives that relate to a lot of NFL players who grew up in religious Christian communities, white and black, that relate to Jordan River baptisms, this sort of messianic kind of narratives, and they bring them over there to be ambassadors to Israel when they come back to the U.S. with totally whitewashed experiences of what goes on in terms of the occupied West Bank, the besieged Gaza Strip, and really the Jackson thing was just kind of a tipping point in terms of just getting us to dive into this larger unholy alliance. I really feel, but make no mistake, what he said is not okay, and it needs to be talked about. But it needs to be framed in a way that's fully contextualizes the experiences and the reality on the ground in the occupied West Bank and really besieged Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you raised the point of, the indoctrination of Americans through this whole religious ideology that people get a lot of their understanding about Israel from in this country. But I feel like this whole situation with Desean Jackson and his tweets also obscures the long history of American anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with, Christianity, so to speak, but just the very long history of anti-Semitism in this country and the propensity for people in power to scapegoat Black people when this kind of thing happens and paint all Black people as, particularly more anti-Semitic than the entire American culture, when really these ideologies come from being steeped in and taught in and indoctrinated by and in this culture in this country. So it's like the pot is calling the kettle. That's a bad pun, but you know where I'm going to end up with that.
Right.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how focusing on Desean Jackson and claiming that, Black people are more anti-Semitic than other people. Look at what Desean Jackson said is also just another deflection from another issue in American society, which is American anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. They can really go back to World War II and look at the kind of discourse that went on in this country, and when the U.S. was allied with the Soviet Union and fighting the Nazis in Europe in that context. And, let's don't forget that it was the U.S. that sent actual Jewish refugees back to Europe, and did not accept them. There were alliances that, the political Zionists, people that are, that had this, just singular drive for the establishment of a Jewish national state, to not allow, actually, they were pressuring the U.S. government not to allow more refugees in, because that would maybe weaken the ability to, get more into Palestine. And there's also just, you look at the history of contemporarily Christian Zionism and the way, you see, especially in the Republican Party. I mean, Max, who came on the show, wrote a book called Republican Gomorrah back that really was a bestseller. It was his first book. And really dives into the psyche of like the Christian right. And he went to a conference in DC one time, and Christians United for Israel. You see groups like this with, objectively anti-Semitic pastors like the pastor John Hagee in Texas that's made all sorts of just outrageous anti-Semitic comparisons. They don't really have any care for Jewish culture. Max talks about how there was a conscious decision made to not build a museum of Jewish history in D.C., but to have it just focus on the Holocaust. He said, think of all the contributions Jews have made to culture in America, academia, early, sport, like Hank Greenberg and Bob Cousy from the Boston Celtics, Greenberg being from the Detroit Tigers. These were real heroes. And think of music and culture and academia and just political and social life in America. But that wasn't that there was a conscious decision made, and for whatever reason didn't go that way. But the way in which anti-Semitism is normalized, and then also the disciplining of Desean Jackson, I think in the DC context, you see, look, Trayon White had a similar thing, the Ward 8 city councilman, where he kind of stepped in it with kind of some Rothschild conspiracy type stuff, and instead of digging into like where it comes from, because I really don't think it's like a guy like Trayon White or Desean Jackson or these innate anti-Semites that pose like a sort of like violent risk the way that like white nationalists do or whatnot. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, because of how stratified we are by class, that there's a lack of like genuine just interaction. And you see it in the segregation of our schools. We see it in day-to-day life. And as a result, a lot of times the only interactions people have across these lines are, and I mean, I see it where I work here in Jersey City right now, where, in a overwhelmingly, majority black school, and it's like a lot of the kids will come and like ask these things, and you realize the only interactions they've had with Jewish people are like, a negative one, maybe with a landlord or something, and that is just hardly, and that really. But these are kids, they're just reflecting that. And instead of using that as a starting point to say, okay, well, it's the same thing where like some white person will maybe say they don't like black people because they've had a negative interaction anecdotally in their own life, right? And then making whole assumptions that define like racist attitudes and differentiating that from people that hold real power, people that hold power to actually create policy and then to obscure these things that come out of a Trayon White or come out of a Desean Jackson, to have us talk about that instead of the fact that Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump are using the pandemic to push forward with the annexation of the West Bank, just brazenly, ignoring international law and just the basic human rights of Palestinians, and whitewashing their voices. And they get into the NFL's relationship. We really get into how they've used ambassadors such as now Buffalo Bills corner Josh Norman, people such as NFL Hall of Famers Marshall Faulk, and people. They had a trip recently last year where you wouldn't believe it. It was just a who's who of everybody in the NFL you can imagine going to Israel and for the opening of Bob Kraft's like new football field there, and going on these tours. And then there's all these other videos where you have NFL alums and players having emotional baptisms in the Jordan River, going around touring Jerusalem, and literally not one mention of anything to do with what goes on in Palestine, the Israeli government's treatment of black people that come up from sub-Saharan Africans. It's truly mind-altering and just creates a reality in terms of how it's perceived in the States that's by people listening, and you consumers of mainstream media, that just is totally divorced from reality. And I think really does a disservice to actually a genuine conversation about anti-Semitism, which quite frankly comes from far-right type people. Look at the shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue there, the Tree of Life Synagogue, and you have people that believe in these great, just outright unhinged conspiracies about Jews and world power domination and whatnot. And the irony is Donald Trump, being as pro-Israel as he is, has really given space and normalized a lot of these people by holding them up as great Americans and patriots and whatnot. And instead of looking at how, while they may support Israel, because ethnocratic people like the idea of ethno-states, let's not worry about their actual anti-Semitism. Let's just as long as you support Israel, as we see in the case with Hungary with Viktor Orban, who is just straight up neo-fascist, and you see with the far right people in Poland, that the just reelected Polish president, they don't really go after these people. And this group from the depths that has used this New Jersey, multi-millionaire corrupt real estate developer, Edward Bosberg, to invite Jackson to Auschwitz to come have this discussion. This guy goes on Mike Huckabee's show on the Trinity Broadcasting Network and is praising Trump, saying that if Trump would have been president during World War II, he would have bombed the crematoriums. He would have basically done everything and taken the Nazis out, implying, I guess, that Roosevelt was weak and that we needed a Trump back then or something. I mean, they're praising the idea that the embassy being moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is objectively a terrible thing for any sort of trying to move towards a peace process. So that's who Desean Jackson is learning from now. And you have this highly publicized interview and discussion they had and Zoom call, and we're not looking at like, okay, yeah, we can respect the fact that this man suffered in the Holocaust, but he's also 94 now, and he's had a whole life here in the States and has done very well. And it shouldn't obscure the fact that, how they're exploiting the situation to fit around like really right-wing political narratives that are very much harmful to Black communities and people of color and working class people all over this country. So, I think we really need to explore it and hold the NFL accountable. And I hope that people will be able to check out our work with Redspin Sports on this. And part 1 is already out on YouTube, and part 2 will be out soon. And it's some mind-blowing stuff. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, in our last couple of minutes here, Nate, I think a couple of things. Number one, I just think it's gross that a serious issue like anti-Semitism and the need for education around it is sort of being cynically used, frankly, as a cover for genocide against the Palestinian people on the one hand, and also how this narrative around Desean Jackson, I think, is unfortunately being used to sort of feed into this thing that I think Jacquie touched on earlier about like Black America being the nerve center of anti-Semitism. I mean, which is ridiculous because, we, Black folks as an aggregate, we don't control any institutions through which we could oppress Jewish folks on the one hand. Now, there's anti-Semitism in Black America, to the extent that anti-Semitism exists in this country. It's just like you could go to any community and find, what we would call reactionary tendencies. But if what we're saying we want to do is to deepen understanding across racial, ethnic, and cultural lines, then, covering up for like apartheid of another group just doesn't seem like the best way to carry that out.
It really, really doesn't. And it's really a shame. And it's not something that's new, but this particular incident really did strike me because, again, like I go back to this being the pandemic, and like a lot of times live sports do serve as like a distraction in a lot of ways. We hear this discourse a lot about, oh, Kaepernick, like I don't have a problem with his message, but sports are my safe space away from all the politics and stuff, and implying the idea that sports are somehow just metaphysically apart from like the rest of the world, and that like athletes are just there to sort of entertain and to be this like spectacle for people to consume. It's apart from their other life to just let them escape. And the reality is that's not the way the world works. And like you just alluded to, the power dynamics, like this whole conversation has completely collapsed, like the whole analysis of power and who holds power, and the idea that people, instead of having a conversation, instead of trying to really make it about let's learn from it, it's clearly like about Desean Jackson. You need to pay a penance for this, right? You have been disciplined by your team. It hasn't really been publicized that much what exactly that is. But nonetheless, he has been, and I'm sure it's steep penalties. And it's hard to see, really think about it and see what's happened since then, who he's kind of being, discussing this issue with and learning from, quote unquote, and not, think that part of that, quote, reclamation project, Desean Jackson, is essentially more so about learning that the importance of embracing Israel as being one and the same with fighting anti-Semitism. And that's just fundamentally ahistorical when you see who the Israel lobby embraces in the U.S. and the kind of if straight up anti-Semites they whitewash in terms of Christian Zionist pastors in exchange for their support. So we need to hold them accountable and continue to look at this unholy alliance the NFL has with these Israel trips that are just mind-altering, to say the least, when you really dig into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Americans got to be the only people in the world who think that sports are somehow apolitical. But thanks so much for joining us today, Nate. We're going to leave it there. We'll move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. But we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.